All right, this is the third part in building resumes. The purpose of this is to do a live demonstration on how we pull together all the formats of a resume. We give you some more advanced information on how you can troubleshoot some things that are going wrong with your resume. And also we'll send you off the template that we're going to create live during this demonstration. However, some of you may be fairly new to Microsoft Word. If that's the case, I highly recommend you take a look at some of the previous offerings through CareerForce, and that is the three-part series, specifically with about the technical aspects of Word, not specifically towards what you would use in a resume. So this deals with mail merge and columns and all sorts of things that we're not necessarily going to be going over, but you can certainly look at these links at in your own time, and I'll include them in the follow-up notes that you will receive. To follow along with an open version of Word, if you have that, please feel free. That's perfectly okay. If your version doesn't look the same as my version, it could be because we have a different version. Everything that I'm going to be talking about today will be very similar to what you would see in Word 2010 through 2019. That does not mean that previous versions of Word aren't also going to work. It's just going to look a little different. So I highly recommend that you do a little Google search and maybe you take a topic I'm talking about and then you say something like Format Painter in MS Word 2003, and it'll show you exactly how to do that. The way we do it is similar. Where we find it might be a little different. If you don't have, that's perfectly okay. I don't recommend anyone go out and purchase Word. The reason is there's a lot of free opportunities out there. One of them is to create a free Microsoft account. You'll get a basic web-based version of Word with that. LibreOffice is my go-to tool for anyone who gets a computer that doesn't have a word processor on it. I'll include the link to download that. Again, everything we're going to be talking about today can be done on all of these platforms, with the exception possibly of the free web-based version of Word. Some of the tools might not be available, but the general concepts can be reapplied. And then many people coming out of an education situation are very comfortable using Google Docs. I would recommend that any Google Doc that is your resume be converted to a Word document before you send it to an employer. They're just more used to seeing it that way. All right, this is some of the information I've repeated at every stage of this three-part series, but some people are jumping in for the first time today. So what are we covering today? Like I said, we'll be doing a live demonstration of creating a resume. And what I hope to do during this time is create each of these pieces. I can give you some troubleshooting techniques at each step. I've looked at thousands of resumes. I've helped people for about 20 years in resume development, and some of the same things happen over and over again. And it's frustrating because you don't know why it's happening. All you know that it's making your resume not look as professional as you want it to. And you're focusing more on creating the resume as opposed to marketing yourself with the resume. So hopefully I can help you with some of those issues. Also, if you have any questions, it doesn't have to be something I'm covering. You can say, this happened to me once in MS Word. I don't know why. Any ideas on how to fix it? And if I have some examples, I'll replicate it while we're here. I'm also going to show you something that maybe some of you are familiar with, but it's new to most people, and that's the formatting pane, the reveal formatting pane. At some point, it's above what we're trained to do, and we might say, I just don't know. I've tried everything. Well, there's an option that will reveal everything that is within a paragraph, all the formatting. And sometimes that helps to troubleshoot what the issue is. And of course, your questions. This will be a very short session if there aren't any questions. I'm really hoping to give you plenty of time to interact. All right, so let's get going. First up, about templates. I talk about this every single time because, and I try to do it a little bit different each time, so it's not me repeating the same information, but templates are a way many people get their initial resume. I'm not going to be using a template today, and there are several reasons for that. One, I can just send you the template, and then we could be done today. We're going to be creating it from scratch. The reason I'm not very fond of templates is they're limiting. They're very good for creating something very quickly. However, they're limiting in the way you can edit them. And additionally, I am seeing more and more that the templates that are available are, for the most part, and I would say 90%, inappropriate to today's job search in Minnesota. I'm not sure where some of these come from or what employers value some of these templates. I think it has a lot to do with the fancier they look, the more people will click on them, and the more revenue for whatever website is driving that. So these are usually created in the tables format, and they can be difficult to edit. We're going to be using the tables format within the resume I create today, but the entire resume is not in the tables format. So I'm going to give you an example of what I mean by that. So within Microsoft Word itself, you can go to the Backstage view, which is clicking on File on the left and clicking on New, and then you can search for resume templates. Look at these resume templates. I can guarantee you, with most of the employers that I deal with today, would be very thrown from these. These are very fancy templates. A lot of them have people's pictures on them. I wouldn't recommend putting your picture on your resume. We put it on our LinkedIn account, but we don't put it on our resume because I don't want any preconceived notions in an employer's mind above and beyond what I have to offer. So there's no need for me to put my picture on my resume. And a lot of color. I mean, this one, my goodness, it's so busy. It would be really hard to find out what you're really trying to market. The only exception to this would be someone who's going into graphic arts. They might want a little bit of a fancier resume. So I'm hoping I instilled a little caution as far as templates are concerned. But we'll go on to the first stage of resumes, which is the header. Now, headers do not have to be fancy. All they are is telling an employer who you are and how they can contact you. Now, there are exceptions to every rule I'm going to give you. There are situations in which you may do something a little different, and there might be a very valid reason to do that, and that's perfectly fine. So I'm not going to argue against any exception to anything I'm talking about today. But I do believe you need to have a header in there. So here's a very simple header. It's just the name of the person. You choose whether you want to put the full address or not. Again, that there's situations in which that's a benefit. There's situations where that's not, and you choose whether that benefits you or might detract from your resume. However, you should have a phone number, and this is more along the lines of what you put in a resume as opposed to how you format it. But make sure that you're checking that voicemail. Make sure you have a professional voicemail. Make sure you have a professional email account. I choose to put a live link on my resume. I've heard people argue against that also. They say, well, employers might not want to have a live link on a resume. And by live link means that it's hyperlinked. It's blue, it's underlined. If I were to click on that, it would pop up in their email client. I've never had an employer argue against that. If you have specific knowledge, perfectly fine. You can take that off. I like it in the fact that it adds a little appropriate color to my resume. I don't color my text. I don't add objects, but it really pops a little. I think it pops a little bit on your resume to have some color through this means. You might say that's kind of boring, but it's one effective method of doing it while maintaining that professional look. Now, if you have more than just your email account to market about yourself, if you have multiple things you want them to look at, you don't want to go too far. But you might choose to do something like this. Maybe it's your name and address and everything, and then your Gmail account or whatever email address you're looking at, and then your LinkedIn on the side. I'd recommend that if you are going to put your LinkedIn, you be very considerate of, or consider, is it something I want employers to see? Is it complete? Is it up to date? Does it look good? Share it with some people and say, can you give me some feedback on that? Or maybe even take next week's job club on next Tuesday. We're going to be talking a lot about LinkedIn. So you'll get some really good tips on that. But one of the tips is make sure you have what I call a vanity URL. And that means it's just a truncated kind of quick link to your actual website. It's shortened, and you can get that for free. It's one of the things you can get for free on LinkedIn. I don't have a paid LinkedIn account, but that's one of the things that is available on a free LinkedIn account. We'll pause just for a second. See, Glory popped up here. Go ahead.
Yes. So it was kind of cute because somebody had asked, is it okay to put the LinkedIn connection in the header, and you had just put it up right after they asked that. So great timing, Art. We have somebody else who asked, how do you make it a hyperlink again?
So most of the time, and I apologize if I'm flipping back and forth between screens, but that's going to happen a lot. I'm going to, Gloria, can you just tell me, are you seeing my Word screen?
Yes, blank
Okay.
Word. Yep.
This only happened to me once, in which I was typing away on Word and thinking I was doing great, and no one was seeing what I was talking about. So I ask every time. So if I'm going to put in any kind of a URL or a email account, like let's say art.larson@gmail.com. Now I do go in and I put that lowercase just because it bugs me to have uppercase in an email account. It's not going to hurt anything, but it bugs me. Because there's an @ and there's a .com, Word knows that's a email address. So as soon as I hit space, it will hyperlink it. Now, I do not recommend about putting live links into words. Like if you were to download or take a copy of a resume off a recipe off a website and put it into a Word document, it would be a whole bunch of live links there that would link you to ads or link you to other websites. However, if for whatever reason you can't get this to link, like say it just doesn't work, what you would do is you would select that information, you would right click on it, and then you would go to hyperlink. You can add your hyperlink to it, and then click OK, and then it's going to be linked. I always take that, I should have taken the mail to out, but that's how you do it. It's just a simple right click, and then you can edit that hyperlink. It will be linked directly.
Thank you, Art.
Yeah.
We do have one more question.
Sure.
It says, how do you shorten your LinkedIn account number?
So that changes so often that I can't off the top of my head tell you exactly from memory where you click, and I'm not going to bring up my LinkedIn account during this session. However, if you just Google shorten LinkedIn URL, it'll tell you step by step. It's really easy to do, by the way. It's not hard at all. And Sean Morgan, who will be running our LinkedIn class next Tuesday, will have extra information on that. Tell you what, if Gloria will remind me, I will include that also in the notes I send along on Monday. So what if you have 3? I wouldn't go any more than 3, but there are some people who, let's say, are very artistic or have some work samples that they want an employer to see, or let's say a WordPress includes, some of their photography or some presentations. They might want to have 3 links. In that case, it would look really silly to have them all on top of each other. There's not enough room with your phone number to put them in here. So another option is something like this. I will caution you on this, though. If you're not comfortable with all the formats going on here, there's a lot going on. There's some columns, there's some column breaks, there's some lines. Some people are cautious about lines because they think it'll mess up your resume through an applicant tracking system. Be aware of all those things, but it can create the best format in the situation you're in. Yes, Gloria.
So someone is commenting, they wrote, there is a line under the second version of the header. Will that line confuse the programs that filter resumes?
So this is an example of, maybe some very specific knowledge that, yes, it will. And I mean, I heard for 10 years, I heard that when a resume hits a line like that, the computer thinks it's the end of the page. And what it'll do is it'll skip down 3 inches to get to the top of the next page. And so you're missing out on the top third of your resume being scanned. And for a while that was true for certain employers, but generally it was true when they were scanning in your resume from a piece of paper. In a digitized format, I have yet to run into any applicant tracking system. And by the way, there are over 600 applicant tracking systems that's an issue with. If you're cautious, you're saying, I just don't want to take that risk, perfectly fine. You remove it off. I include it on mine because I always know what the system is for the employers that I am submitting my applications to. I do enough networking where I know how they track their applicants. I know what to look for. So I have what I call specific knowledge. Now, you may not go into it that deeply. You may be applying employers per week for you to be able to do that effectively. Yes, then make it as simple as you're comfortable with. Okay. All right. So I'll do a live demonstration real quick on how you do this. There's nothing really fancy to the first, but you always want to make sure you're using the easiest format possible. So we're not going to over. We're not going to hit the tab button a bunch of times. We're not even going to set a custom tab for centering. We're just going to use a center alignment. Type in John Smith. The one thing that's going to trip you up on your resume right off the bat is with the heading. And again, I mention this at every single class I do because it's a huge frustration for a lot of people, is you're going to run into a spacing issue. So as soon as I go to that next line, you're going to see that it's spaced more than I want it to be. I'll make this very simple. I'll say that he lives on Smith Street. In your address that you put on your resume, go a little bit more formalized than you would with other things, meaning that spell things out. I even spell out the state. So say this person lives in Saginaw, Minnesota. I see a lot of people doing this. Instead of Minnesota, they will do that, which is wrong. Or they'll do this, which is wrong. Or really show your age. This is how I was taught. Not right. The only thing that's right is this, capital N, or Minnesota. Okay. So once you have that all there, or even before you start, it's not a bad idea to remove the offending format. That offending format is something called spacing after paragraph. And there's two ways to get at it. The first way is to go to the paragraph grouping, click on your dialog box launcher or your options arrow, and remove the spacing after paragraph. So put it to 0. And I recommend doing that right off the bat with your resume. There are times where that is a very beneficial format to have when you're creating, let's say, narrative text. But for this, it is more of a nuisance. Yes, Gloria?
Somebody is asking, is there a preferred font that employers like?
Yeah, well, I can tell you what I like. And what I like is what most employers like. And so Calibri is the default font. And you can find your fonts right up here. That's what most employers really are used to seeing. That does not mean you can't use other fonts. The other fonts, in fact, let me do this. I'm going to do that, and I'll show you the slight difference you'll get for each one. So we have Calibri here, and I'll change this to another sans serif font, which is Tahoma. That's also very popular. And then we'll go on, which is a little older than both of those, or been around a little longer, is Arial. And you'll notice there's not much difference. There's not much difference in how they look. However, Tahoma will be a little bit bigger. It's a little thicker, and that's why it's not as used, because companies actually save ink. Someone did a study on how much money is saved by going to a thinner font. And nationwide, it was in the millions of dollars. For any organization, it's pretty minimal, but a large organization may choose to be branded at a font that is the most cost efficient. So I guess A+ answer to that question is go to the company's website, copy and paste information off their website, and put it into a Word document. And then when you click on it, it'll tell you what kind of font that is. And that's what I use. I honestly do that. I don't know if anyone notices, but I figure it can't hurt to show them something they're used to seeing. The one I would stay away from for most employers is Times New Roman. That was the default font for Word for many, many years. It is a serifed font, meaning that it has all the little extra. It looks a little more old-fashioned. There are competing readability studies on if this is easier to read than this or not. you'll find whatever you're looking for, but I choose to think that a sans serif font is much easier to read. It just looks cleaner, and it certainly looks more current. You always want to increase the font size of your name, and I usually bold it. It's the one time I bump up the font, and usually what I do is I just make it big enough so it covers the address. If you have a huge address, that's going to look silly, but you can play around with it. There's really no exact font size for your name. I've had them very big because they stand on their own. I've had them a little bit bigger because they're in line, but it's the one time you can go a little bit bigger. For the rest of my resume, I know this seems maybe a little too tight of a, it doesn't allow you much leeway, but I keep the same font size for everything else. I keep the same font for everything else. I do see some people embellish their name just a little bit with a different font. I mean, that's up to you. Don't go too crazy with it. Maybe you think it makes it stick out. That's the only time I guess I ever would even do that. I don't, but that's the one opportunity maybe you could be a little bit more stylistic there. Any more questions on the heading before we move forward?
Yes, I just have one more. It says, is it okay to just have your city and state with no street address?
Again, I do get that question a lot, and it's changed over the years. I always used to say, include your full street address if you actually lived in the area you're applying to, because it says to an employer, I live here. I am firmly located here. If you bring me in for an interview, it's going to be worth your while. And the reason is when the internet first started, being a place for people to look for work, a lot of people would apply all over the place. They say, it'd be fun to work in Florida. I'm going to throw a resume down there. And if they didn't have an address, an employer would be very cautious because they're thinking, where are they from? I do realize why people don't want to put their address on for other reasons. They don't want to be, if I happen to live in a more crime, a place where there's more crime, a certain part of time, a town where maybe that's in the news more recently, I don't want to be filtered out of consideration because an employer might have a bias against that part of town. And I understand that. That's totally up to you. However, unless there's a reason not to, I always include my street address because they're going to look for it at some point. I have nothing that I don't want them to know about that. And it says that, hey, I'm from this area. I'm in a commutable distance between work and where I live. So long answer to a short question, yes, you can. All right, as far as putting the address on there, like I said, you can just put John Smith here.
Do you mind if I ask one more question?
Yeah, go
Because
ahead.
it's in regard to this. Okay, so somebody is wondering, should we put our address if we are applying for positions outside of Minnesota? What should we do if we are looking to relocate?
In that case, it's all about setting the stage. What I would do is I would leave it off. They're going to see it on the application, but I would put some notice in there that willing to relocate. I would also use that as an opportunity to reach out to that employer over the phone. They don't want you to call about, applying because that's what their applicant system is for, and they don't want to, answer the phone every time someone wants to call. But if you want to start that connection and overcome that objection, you may call and just say, I just wanted to let you know I did submit a letter of interest, a cover letter, and filled out an application. If there's any questions about my willingness to relocate, I wanted to let you know that I have firmly vetted your community. I'm very interested in relocating there, and that wouldn't be a problem whatsoever. That has two bonuses. One, and by the way, they might not take your call. I get that, but the one bonus is you've potentially overcome the objection, but also it gives you an opportunity to talk to that employer. I've seen people do that and get an interview on the spot multiple times. I've also heard we don't want your call. I get that. So try it once, and if you are getting some agreement to them being able to take your call, it could start that relationship on a more personal level. So in this case, it's automatically hyperlinked. If I wanted to add, let's say, a LinkedIn account here on the same line, then what I would do is I would left align this. I'm going to make this small here, and then I would add a custom tab. So a custom tab, make sure you have the tab, which is this one right here. It's the left tab, it's called. I'm going to put that at 1 inch, and I'll tab to it. And then I'm going to put another tab at about, let's say, 5 inches. And I'm going to start typing in my LinkedIn account once I get to it, actually. I know this is not a real account. LinkedIn.com. Okay. So now I can play around with it. It doesn't look quite right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move those tab settings, and I have to be in that line, in that paragraph for this to work. And now I can move them around, and I can make it just look as best it can in that situation. Okay? And you can see already just those slight adjustments makes it look a lot better. Here's a situation in which we have some people have some issues. So I look at this and I'm seeing that the street address is not lined up right. Well, I click on that line and I see it is centered. I click on this line and I see that it is centered. So the reason this line is not centering the way I want is that when you center, when you use a center alignment, it centers between the indents, not the margins. So your margins are this area, between the gray and the white. So this is your margin right here. That's your left margin. And here's your right margin. But this hourglass looking thing, that's your indent. And if that happens to be over a little bit, it's going to center in between the indent, not the margin. So when I click on this kind of off-centered address, I look over here and I see that for whatever reason, the indent had been pushed to the right a half an inch. So that creates that slight off-centered look. So all you have to do is move that over and it works. What I've seen people do in the past is they use a bunch of spacing. They just try to make it work. And I understand that. You need to get your resume out. You know, when they print it off, they're not going to know the difference. However, if that happens to you, you get it out, great. Now work on making it a better format because it's going to just cause you less frustration. It's going to look better next time, and you'll be, you know, excited about applying for the job, not frustrated with getting your resume looking right. All right. So I'm going to move that back over. The next thing we're going to talk about is the various different types of introductions you can put between that, your heading, and maybe your work history. If you choose to go with a chronological resume, which is a listing of your work history from the most recent down to the earliest that you're willing to go back, usually 10 to 15 years, although again, exceptions to every rule, you might have various types of sections. So you could have an objective, you could have a skills summary, a qualification summary. You see a lot of different things, and there's no right or wrong on this. It's just make sure that whatever you put there has a purpose. It says something. Don't put it there simply because you saw it on other people's resumes or it was included in the template. Then what you end up doing is wasting a lot of the short period of time you have with an employer on saying nothing. So I usually don't use an objective statement, but if you're going to, you could just put objective. Welding position on company website ID 74382. That is a purpose. It tells them, if you're looking at this resume, here's why you're looking at it. I want this welding job. Now, I've had people say, well, they're going to know that because your resume is attached to your application. It is in the applicant tracking system. It is not outside of that. And most people who interview do not see the application. That's for HR purposes. They see the application. They send on the resumes to those who are qualified. So if I'm printing off a resume or I've got a whole bunch of resumes and I've got 5 jobs to fill, they're sitting on my desk. I don't know about you, but my desk is not an organized location that I'm going to be able to have 5 separate files. So once it's printed off, an objective can cement in an employer's mind what this is in relation to. Skill summary is fine. However, I like qualification summary. And the reason I like qualification summary is I have a lot of skills, but not all those skills make me qualified for a job. So I want employers to see, of the skills I have, here's a summary of what they are in relation to what makes me qualified for this job. I don't know if employers think in that way, but it helps me to focus in on what am I marketing about myself. Okay? So this is a very simple thing to do on a Word document. I'm just going to bring this over here. And then we have qualification summary. You're just bolding that. Bolding it in and of itself makes it more, makes it stand out. You know, allows you to jump from section to section. There are a few different methods you can do that by. You could capitalize it, put it in the all caps format. And the way you do that is you go to the font grouping and click on the change case option, and you put it uppercase. Some people like that, some people don't. Be aware it will not spell check this. I mentioned this quite a bit in my workshops, but if you start off in all caps, make sure that at some point you put into lowercase to spell check it, because otherwise it'll assume it's an acronym and you'll get misspellings for, you know, no apparent reason. For an employer standpoint, they just see that you misspelled something and you were hoping a red squiggly would have pointed that out to you, and it didn't. And the reason is, oops, because I put a lower I there. See that it does not spell check it for me. So I select it again. I put it into lowercase, and then put it into the correct spelling, and then I put it back into uppercase. Now, one of the things that is not available here that you do see sometimes on resumes is something called the small caps format, meaning that it has a larger uppercase first letter and then smaller uppercase for the rest of the word. I think it looks a little dated, but if that's something you're interested in, then you're going to have to go to the more options or the dialog box launcher right here, and then you can click on small caps. And then it's going to look a little bit different depending on the font you have. Not all fonts are going to work well with this. So in this case, I don't see. In certain fonts, it'll make a difference. Yes, Gloria.
Okay, so the question is, why did you put a line in it if you said the automated scanner might view that as the end of the page?
Okay, and sorry if I didn't mention that or define that appropriately. The reason I do it is because I happen to know the employers that I market myself to don't have that issue. I happen to know that the employer I marketed my resume to doesn't even use an applicant tracking system, and that they view all of their resumes on a case-by-case basis by a person. And I happen to think it looks better with the line. Also, every single applicant tracking system I've looked at in the area, it's not an issue for. But again, if you have any concerns about that, all you have to do is go to the paragraph grouping and remove it based on wherever that happens to be. There we go. And you see it. I think it looks better myself with the line. But again, it's not anything you have to do. Absolutely not. The one thing I will say that is an absolute no-no is going with a text box. So if I go to insert and I put in a text box, even if I remove the lines from it, this, by the way, to format things because you can drag it anywhere you want. And some people think, oh, I can't get it to work, so I'll just put a text box in there. It may not look at that. In fact, that's the least likely thing to be parsed or considered by an applicant tracking system. Now, you'll hear the same thing with tables. You know, if you look on the internet and say, well, tables mess up my the ability of my resume to be seen properly by an applicant tracking system, you will get that. However, I would say 90% of the templates people use for their resume are in the table format. So either no one's getting their resume seen correctly, or that information might be a little outdated based on today's applicant tracking system standards. All right.
Do you mind if I ask one more question, Art, before you go on?
Please do.
Thank you. So there is a person that says, after 20 years of being a pastor, I'm leaving the ministry and trying to re-enter the workforce. What is the best style of resume for someone to use in my position?
I would go with a skills-based or what we call combination resume. And that looks like, let's see here. In fact, I think it's the example I'm using, working off. So let's see if I can find it here. Let's see. Well, of course, when I'm looking specifically for that. I'll send you that template along with the follow-up information. The idea there is, if you're a pastor, you are, there's so many different things you're doing that might not be obvious to an employer. They may just see, oh my gosh, this person is in ministry, and they maybe have some public speaking, but that's all they do, which is silly, but there is so much more to it. So what you do is you look at the qualifications for the job, and then you paint a picture for them. And that can really help to do a qualification summary. You do a qualification summary, you paint what they want to see before they even get to the fact that you achieved these qualifications through your ministry or whatever that happens to be. And then you go into the skills honed during that 20 years or so, customer service, budgeting possibly, customization or public speaking, whatever those happen to be. So you already tell them what the value is of that employment before they find out what that employment was. Now, you're still going to have to, win them over to a certain extent if it's widely different than what they may perceive as, the work history they're looking for. However, if you start off with a chronological resume and you say, 20 years, pastorate, blank, blank, blank. They're going to already have determined in their mind what that means. They're going to think about, oh, that's not applicable to what we want. A skills-based resume allows you to paint a much better picture. And if we can get one of those up here at some point, I will do that for you. Otherwise, like I said, I'll send you a template for that. All right. Another way you can do this, in fact, you can actually have two of these introductory statements or introductory sections. I wouldn't go more than two. I've seen people do like 3 or 4, and by the time they get to the employment, it's you've already lost me. So in this case, we could go to something called just a skills, a relevant skills section. Now you got to be a little bit careful on this, in that it's not just throwing keywords out there. These have to be things that you actually can give an employer. And it's not more is more. In fact, you never hear that, do you? It's always less is more. So you don't want to try giving them 20 different bullets that are keywords off of their job posting. But if you truly have that information and you want to kind of set the stage for, here's what you're going to learn on my resume, you can put them in this way. So to do that, there's, I'll give you a simple way. By the way, anything I'm going to show you, there's like 5 different ways to do it. This happens to be, in my mind, the simplest way. So I'm going to call this content creation skills. So maybe this is a place where you're going to have to do a lot of writing to customers. You're going to have to do a lot of marketing or whatever, and they're asking for very specific skills. And it'd be very hard for you to work those in to a qualification summary or even into maybe your work history effectively. What you might choose to do is do one of these 3-column lists. So the easiest way to do that is to insert a quick table. So you put your insertion point where you want the 3-column list to show up, and you go to Table, which is on the Insert tab, and you go 3 by 3. Okay. Now, of course, the issue here is it's got these lines. Well, let me go ahead and replace what I did there with this. Okay. So let me get rid of this table. I'll leave it there. I'll leave it there so you can kind of see what this looks like. So basically what this is this information with content and stripping out the borders. So to strip out the borders, all you would have to do is you have to select that table. And then once you do that, you have these two contextual tabs that are specific to tables. You have to be in the table for to see those. And you go to the Design tab, you go to Borders, which is in the Borders grouping, and you go to No Borders. And what that is going to do is either completely strip or make non-printing those borders. They're still there, but you either see them or you see them as a dimmed option. And that really has nothing to do with the file. It has to do with the settings within Microsoft Word at any individual computer. So if you send it to an employer, whether they have view grid lines turned on or not will determine whether they see those dimmed lines. However, they won't print. This is what dimmed lines look like. So if you're working off a table format, a table resume template, you quite often see these grid lines. And they won't print, so it's no big deal. But many people are sending these things digitally, and so they say, well, I just don't like that. There's really nothing you can do except save this as a PDF. If you save this as a Adobe Acrobat Reader format file, a PDF, it won't show these non-printing characters. Yes, Gloria?
Okay, so somebody is asking, what about if you had a position for 5 months and a year, and you did a couple different temp jobs during the same year? Would you just use years and not dates on the resume?
So, as everything I'm going to say today, it depends. It really depends on the situation you're in and who you are sending your resume to. So some employers have a very specific requirement for amount of experience. So if you're going to go into the public sector, like I work for the state of Minnesota, and if I were to say that I worked here, it's a really lazy way of doing it, but let's say I work here, and I worked here from 2019 through. That's a way of hiding possibly some gaps in employment. And in the private sector, that may work very well. But in the chat box, if someone would, tell me how much time would an employer give you, a public, like the state of Minnesota or the county or the government, how many days of service time would you get from having your resume look like this? If you're bold enough, go ahead and put it in the chat box. How many days? Judy, you're tough. You're saying 0. John says 2. There's a couple of 2s. Some people may think that's 365 times 2. It is 2 days because they'll only give what can be proven or what can logically be assumed, and they're not going to assume work 1st of 2019 through December 31st of 2020. So they're going to say the only thing I can assume here is that you worked at least 1 day in 2019 and at least 1 day in 2020. So they're going to give you two days of service time. If that job requires 2 years of service time, in this very specific example, I might go this specific. Normally, I would go month to 2 years if it's a shorter term employment. If it's like 10 years that I work someplace, I don't put months. I just put the years I worked there. If it were government employment and there were specific requirements that I were on the edge of, I would put the actual dates. I know that seems silly and it doesn't look quite right, but it's a difference between getting an interview and not getting an interview. So again, specific knowledge trumps anything you're going to hear from anybody. So it's really good to network with someone who works at an employer, or maybe calling that employer or doing a web search online. I know Glassdoor, I haven't used that term in a while, but there's a website called Glassdoor that will have some interaction and they'll tell you some things about an employer. Figure out, if you really are invested in an opportunity, put your best foot forward and work off specific knowledge. So this is a question we get quite a bit, and I see this right in the chat, Erica, so I'm gonna talk to it. What if you were unsure of the date's work? Is it better to just put the first day of the month or guess what the exact day you started? So what looks like a logical guess and what looks like an exact date. If you are going to put, just a random date in there, you're pretty much telling an employer, this is my actual date. I have done this. I have said, oh gosh, I thought it was, it was sometime in January of, in fact, my last 3 jobs ago, I started in January of 2001, coming up on 20 years. I would put January 1st. You're absolutely right. However, it's much better to have the exact date. So, no real good way of doing that unless you do one of 2 things. One is you call that former employer, and I understand many people are coming from a situation which they don't want to call that former employer. However, it's to your benefit to do that because that's something they probably will give you. They should give it to you at least. And that said, could you look at my original date of employment? I had to do that, by the way. I had to call that employer from 20 years ago because I needed a certain amount of service time and I needed exact dates. And it took a week or 2 for me to do that, but I did get it back from them. They did call me back. So start that process now. Now, I get a lot of questions about, well, that employer is no longer, went out of business. Well, thank you, Judy. you segued perfectly to the next point. That former employer went out of business. How can you do that? There is a best guess scenario. However, don't go to the best guess right off the bat. There are other options, and one of the other options is creating an account on the Social Security website and paying for it. I'm not telling you have to pay anything. I'm not saying you have to do this. But for me personally, if it could affect my employment, it's cost a bit of money. It's like, I think something like $94. And if you want a certified copy, I think it's $25 more than that. But there is a fairly easy process to do. I thought it was extremely complicated at one point. Easier. And look at the website to find out information on that. The key is once you get it, keep it up to date and put it in a safe. Put it in a online storage place. Don't put it on your computer in some file someplace, and then when your computer crashes, you don't have it. That's information that was hard fought for, and it impacts your employment, so make sure you keep those dates. The free report you can get does give earnings per year. It doesn't really give you dates or specific employers. If all that fails, best guess is the next best option. But be aware that you're saying I have this, and if they can prove that you don't have this, that can be grounds for termination. And I have seen that happen. All right, so next step we're going to be talking about is work history or experience highlights. So in the example of the person coming from the ministry, this is how you talk about your skill sets. So if maybe you use Word and maybe PowerPoint for some interactive presentations during sermons, those are computer skills that are marketable to any employer. And when you list them outside of the work history, they're not determined by any preconceived notion of what you do. So this is how it would look like in a functional or skills-based resume, and this is what it would look like in a work history section. Now, your work history still has to be there. I will tell you this, and I've heard this over and over from many, many employers. If there's no dates or work history on your resume, they get thrown out. Now, you may have, experience different, so I'm not saying that you could possibly get an interview, but for smaller employers, that might work. If you network your way into a situation, that might work. But I would caution you against thinking that because on the application, they ask for dates, that you don't have to put them on the resume. That is not true in almost all cases. They have to stand on their own. So make sure you're putting at some point your work history. And that can, in a functional or skills base, it can just be on the bottom as line items for your dates of employment. That way you're not dwelling maybe a job 5 years ago in between 2 relevant work experiences that isn't as relevant. You still have to include it for continuity in most cases, so that it doesn't look like a gap in employment, but you're not wasting 5 bulleted points talking about what you did there if it didn't relate, okay? So you determine, based on 2 things, based on what you've done in the past and what you want to do next, which version of a resume is most relevant. That's why I'm going to include a couple different templates, a chronological resume, and you may have gotten these from previous sessions before, but there's a chronological resume template, there is a functional or skills-based template, and a combination template. And depending on your situation, you may use one, and the next week you may use a different one. So it's a really good idea to develop all three. That way, you're just slightly adjusting them based on the needs of the specific application or job posting to quickly and easily apply for a position. Okay, so how you do this one's pretty simple to do. The experience highlights, you're just putting bullets in there, but I'm going to do a live demonstration of how to put this work history together. So I'm going to bring up this blank in here. So if I was the lead trainer, and by the way, there's also multiple ways of doing this. I just want to show you how you get the dates to line up very nicely. And that happens to be with a custom tab. I'm going to remove this custom tab simply because I already have it on there. I'm going to remove it. So there's two steps to this. First step is you have to hit the tab key. And that's the physically struck tab key. And then you can put your dates of employment. So in this case, just for brevity, I'm going to put them in the correct way. So let me talk about that. Be very consistent with the way you put dashes in between your dates. And I know this seems like nitpicking, but it is really important, because if you put a date in like this, and then the next time you put in a date like this, see the difference? They're not going to line up the same. The space before and after the hyphen, in this situation here, we didn't. And that creates an elongated hyphen. And it makes things so they don't line up. And employers who look at resumes all day do notice those kinds of things. So whatever format you choose, stick with it. Okay? Sometimes you have to backspace it out to get it to look right. Okay, so I've got the dates in there. I've got something called a default tab in there, and I'm turning my show hide on to see those tab characters. Then all I have to do is choose the correct custom tab on the left-hand side here. I just go through it, I click through it. I know it's really hard to see, but I click through it until I get something called a right tab. And if I hover over it, it'll tell me what it is. And then I go to my left margin, I click and I drag on top of that right indent. You can't click directly on it because then it thinks you're trying to increase or decrease the right indent, which is where your text would wrap in a paragraph. It's kind of like a situational margin. So in this case, I'm going to put that custom tab in, click and hold, and drag it on top. If you do that for your first job and leave it there, you don't have to do it again. So now I can say trainer. I hit the tab key, it jumps right to it. Go ahead, Gloria. You're on mute, Gloria.
Sorry about that. How would you suggest including a Coursera experience on your resume? Would you add like the course name, date, certification number, and the issuing institute?
Let's hold off on that until we get to the education section, and we'll get to it. So remind me, okay? All right, so in this case, when I hit enter, I get that weird spacing issue again. So remember to go up and move spacing. That's the page layout tab. That's one way of getting to it. And remove that spacing after, so that when I hit enter, it goes right down. Now, sometimes people want to say, okay, I was a lead trainer at ABC Training. And then they hit the tab key, and then they put Duluth, Minnesota. In this case, the two state initials are fine. You do not have to put in the full address. Also, do not tell me why you left the job in your resume. I've seen people do that. They want to define why they left each job. And I get why you may feel the need to do that for a bunch of short-term job opportunities. There are better ways to do that format-wise than explaining-wise. You can group certain short-term trainings if they were through a staffing agency, let's say. I do recommend against doing this, though. That's going to give you, in most employers' minds, no no interview. I get it, and some people want to say that's my, the best way to promote myself. If you're handing your resume to somebody and you're talking about it, potentially, but if this gets seen by an HR person, you can't answer any questions. And when my resume poses questions I can't answer, it usually leads to a non-interview. So I've seen people do this in the past. It isn't effective in most situations. Okay. You can bold certain things on this. You can choose to bold your years. You can choose to bold your that line. I've seen people do all sorts of different things. Play around with it, see what works, see what looks good for you. Some people like to just bold this part, and they don't want to bold that part. So you could maybe just bold this information and not that. It's up to you, whatever works. Make sure that they line up perfectly, because if they don't line up perfectly, it's going to be a visual issue, which has nothing to do with content, but unfortunately it does relate to attention to detail, and if I'm looking at a bunch of resume and one is formatted incorrectly, and other people who are equally qualified have a cleaner, crisper resume, I may choose to use that as a filtering option. By the way, that's been forever. This precedes computers. When I first started doing this, we had 3 filing cabinets chock full of every single application from any sized employer in my area. So I had hundreds of employers, and I kept their application. And the filtering device for those employers were a neatly filled out application. A neat resume means a well-formatted resume. So it's the same thing. It hasn't changed. It's nothing new to computers. All right. Now, in this situation, I'm going to use this twice, but in this situation, your best friend in working with tabs or bullets or indents or anything is the format painter. And I mention this at every single opportunity I can because it's such a great tool and most people don't use it effectively. What the format painter does is it copies the formats, not the text of a paragraph. I don't even have to select the paragraph, I just have to be in it. So looking at this, I see that this paragraph has a different tab setting than this paragraph. They're set differently. So all I do is I click in that paragraph, I click on Format Painter, and I click on the other paragraph. I'm going to do that again. I click on the paragraph like, which happens to be this one. Click on the Format Painter, which is in the clipboard grouping on your Home tab, and I click Format Painter. And then I click on the format I don't like. And what it does is it makes them the same. It doesn't change the text, it just makes them the same. Okay. So I'm going to respond to a quick question I see right here. So XYZ company gives no idea what it is. I've added a brief 3 to 4 word description. Any thoughts? This would be important if you are working outside or applying in a larger area or outside of your area. Let's say that you're, applying, in a different state. Most of the time, I don't put that in there. However, if you think that it's going to benefit you by showing the connection between that employer and what this current employer does, you might do that. Yeah. Let's see here. Was there a clarification on that? Outside of normal work history. So if it's outside of your normal work history, meaning that it's something that doesn't relate, I wouldn't add any description. And the reason I wouldn't is now you're clarifying that this doesn't relate to the employer's needs. If it helps me, I put it in. If it doesn't, I don't. And in that case, especially if I have one of those jobs that is going to waste some space, I still have to have it there in most cases. Then I would go with that combination or skills-based resume. That way, that job, XYZ job, only takes up 1 line. Lauren?
Yeah, somebody is asking, what if you worked at a position worked at a position 25 years ago that would qualify for a job that you want to do now?
Okay. So the example we give is, it's 10 to 15 years, of service time, or 10 to 15 years you go back. Now, if that job was 25 years ago and it relates, you have to ask yourself logically, do I still have those skills? Okay. And in certain situations, I would be not telling the truth if I did, okay? Because I went to school and I learned how to program Pascal. So Pascal is a dead computer language for the almost all cases. And if I were to apply as a computer programmer and say, well, I've got computer programming experience, and I put it on there, one, it's going to really date me by putting it on there by the dates, and two, it's not really relevant. Now, there are some, if you were, maybe you had your own construction business for 20, 25 years ago, and you ran that for 10 years. You still have those skills probably, and it's still relevant. You may consider putting another section, and you might title it outside, you might tell you other relevant work experience. And then you don't have to put the dates on that because you're already 15 years of current work history. This would kind of sweeten the pot a little bit, but the only way it's going to do that, it can only help you tip the scales. It's not going to be something that's the first thing they look at. So you have to make sure you're using the best format to talk about current skills in relation. But if you think that could add some value, you could put a section right before your education called other relevant work experience, and then define that. And you don't have to necessarily put dates on that.
Right? One more question, Art, before you go on to the next subject. We have an accountant who does contract work, and they're asking, would you provide some examples of how you would present information on a resume?
Yeah. So contract work, doing work through, and by the way, there's a lot of people who do contract work. Increasingly, people are doing contract work. They're doing, what do they call it? I'm a consultant business, and so they do consulting, and it's intermittent, you know. So what you might do is you might say something like contracted accounting work, something. You could probably find a better method of defining that or listing that. But let's say you did that for the last 5 years. That's a really long time in reverse. Make this just a little bit bigger. Here, I'll cheat a little bit. Okay, so in this case, you did it for the last 5 years, but now you want to say, who did you do it for? Okay, in that case, what you might do is you could say ABC. And then you go into 3 bulleted statements here. Oops. I'm not exactly sure what happened there. Second. And then I'm getting a little bit here. By showing you my fancy indents, I really messed up this the format here. So maybe this is CDF company. And the reason I'm doing it this way, even though there might be some slight gaps, in this way using the years is to your benefit. And we're going to pretend that I did another one that listed these out. So it took the full 5 years. But you see what I'm doing there is I'm creating the dual benefit. I'm saying that I have 5 years of work history in the field you want. Now, because those jobs were interspersed through contract work, it's not going to look typical. So if I listed these all as separate, it might look like I'm job jumping. It may look like I'm all over the place. And it would be disingenuous because I didn't work for that company. I was self-employed contracted. So you'll list it under the title of contracted work, or it could be Kelly Services or Manpower or a Deco, like a staffing agency. You're actually working for that company during that time, so you'll list it that way. And then in a different date convention, you put it right next to the company to show the actual time you spent at each of those situations. I found that really works well. It overcomes the perception of job jumping, and it shows you in the best light. Go ahead, Larry.
How do you address a 4-year gap because you had to take care of, for instance, mother who had multiple surgeries?
Okay, so in that case, there's a lot of different ways you can do that. One, I would definitely go with a skills-based resume. And by the way, public service jobs, state jobs, it's at least in that situation, that horrible thing that everyone's thinking about, a gap in work history, is no big deal. Most people at some point have a gap in their employment history. That does not make them any less valuable than someone else, unless it's current and extended. I'm not saying it even makes them any less valuable then. I'm saying it's harder to make the case that it isn't an issue. So if you have current work history and then you do have a gap, one method is to go with the combination resume, or I would actually recommend the skills-based resume, in which you talk about the skills that are relevant. And then in your work history, you might just put in, during that time frame, caregiver or something like that. Don't get too cute with the how you title it. Don't pretend that you worked at a hospital caring for your loved one just because they went to that hospital or were in that nursing home. But you can identify what happened during that time if you choose to. Some people are really, really afraid of showing a gap anywhere. And in that case, I guess I would go with that caregiver designation. And if they ask you about it, have an answer ready. Have an answer ready, because they might. And don't want to go into too much detail. Just say, during that time, I had the opportunity to care for a family member who had great needs at that point. And here's the key. It's no longer something I'm dealing with. That is not a situation going forward. And in the past 5 years, I've been doing this. So you kind of redirect that information or that conversation towards something that is going to be to your benefit, and in the eyes of the employer isn't going to be any kind of a red flag. But it happens more often than you would think. Don't focus too much on it. Deal with it in the best way you can. I would recommend, however, you tell your whole story to someone at a local career force location. They're going to be able to talk with you one-on-one and give them a resume and say, here's that 5 years in which I was dealing with having to not work due to a loved one's illness, and how would I best do that? One situation is so different that one-on-one attention is going to be to your benefit. I'll give everyone the contact information for all 50 career force locations in the follow-up email, and you can reach out. All right. Now, we'll have 10, 15 minutes at the end to get to all questions that we can get to. So what happens if you're putting this resume together and you think you've got everything just down and it's still not doing what you want it to do? You've used Format Painter, you've done all this different types of stuff. There is a really cool option that people use, and I'm going to set this up on the other side. It's called the Reveal Formatting option. And what it'll do is it'll tell you exactly what's going on. You can kind of know what the issue is. First thing I do always is I turn on my show hide. I'm a big believer in the show hide. It tells me, did I do things right? Did I tab things instead of space? Are there any extra non-printing characters that are causing my resume to go to another page? And this is a very common thing that happens to people, but if you have a bunch of enters at the end of your document, it's going to go to another page. And that's unfortunate because it'll actually print out a blank piece of paper on the employer's printer. So, make sure you get rid of those just by deleting them out. But sometimes even that doesn't help you. So what you can do is there's two ways of getting to this. First is you can go to the Styles grouping on your Home tab and click on the dialog box launcher. And then, by the way, styles are just a group of formats. And you can click on something called the Style Inspector. There's a lot of cool things you can do with this. You can remove formats. You can selectively strip formats out. There's some really neat things you can do. But one of the things I like showing is the reveal formatting taskbar or side pane. And whatever line you're in, it's going to tell you what's going on there. Tell you the font, the language, the alignment, the indentation, the spacing, the margins, the layout. And if you have tabs, it's going to show you where your tabs are set. So if there's some weird format that's messing things up, it'll show in here and you can get rid of it. I haven't had to use this a lot, but boy, it's a lot better than being frustrated for a long time. The easy way of getting to this, and it's going to be in the slide deck, instead of going through all those clicks, is you just hit Shift F1. The Shift key, hold on the Shift key and press F1, and you'll get this reveal formatting. But wherever you click, it's going to show you what the format is for that. One of the more common things we run into in inconsistent formatting is bullets that just for whatever reason, you never really figure this out, turn into these bullets. At some point, you'll get these like bullets that happen like this. And I'm not sure exactly why. Let me just jump into this because Anne-Marie has a great question here. A couple of your examples had italics in the example. In the Tuesday workshop, you said not to use italics. Yes, you're right. I'm using some older templates, and it just shows you how quickly things can get dated. So you really remove that very easily. I had stripped them off, most of the ones I had planned to put up here, but some of the other ones had italics in there. So thank you for bringing that up. I choose to take them off. Now, just because on Tuesday I said you shouldn't use that, that's my recommendation. It's been the recommendation of a lot of people I network with, and a lot of information I've taken off the internet from best practices. Does not mean it's a end-all be-all. If you want to put italics in there and you think it looks good and you get some feedback from others that it adds or it's separate, use it. I'm just saying that in most cases currently it is recommended to take that off. So thank you, Anne-Marie. I appreciate your Anne-Marie for bringing up that point. Okay, so in this case, there's two easy ways of getting rid of this inconsistent format. One usually is just to turn them off and turn them back on. And how I did that is I just selected the bullets that were bad, and it just happens for some reason, I'm not sure why. I turn off those bullets and I turn them back on. And usually that'll work, but not always. The other way I do it is I would take the format I like. So I'm going to click in this line because this has a bullet. I'm going to make it more dramatic, by the way. Here, let's make it even more like sub bullets there. So I'm going to click on the bullet I like right here. And your best friend in resume creation is the format painter. I'm going to click on it, and then I'm going to select the bullets I don't like. And usually, I would say 19 times out of 20, even better than 9 times out of 10. 19 times out of 20 is going to do what you want. It won't always, because formats in there that it's not tracking correctly. Thanks, Paul. That's funny. All right. So, questions about bullets or tabs? Because those are two of the, I guess, maybe a little bit more tricky ones as far as consistency before we move on to education. I'll wait for those to get going here.
I don't see any right now, Art.
Okay. And by the way, you can certainly type them in as I'm talking about education. So I like to think of education as bookending my resume. If I'm going, with a bunch of bullets, I like bullets, by the way. I think bullets really are necessary in a resume, because without bullets, it looks like you're reading a book. And it's very hard to jump to, is this part of a paragraph, or should this sit on its own? I really like having bullets, but I never want to have my resume end on a bullet, because that looks like it's trailing off the end of the page. So education I think of as bookending, and I change the format slightly for a couple of reasons. One, normally it's not a list I'm trying to show anyways, but even if it were, I would format it in a different way. There's many different options, and use. It's very simple. I can put education. If it's in the last 5 years, I put the date. I choose to leave it off, my education, because my education is further back than I even want to talk about in this public forum here. It's not going to benefit me to put my date of education, so I leave it off. Are they going to question it? Yeah, they might question how old it is, but I'd rather they question it than me prove to them that it's that long ago. Okay, so totally up to you. Some people put their education section at the very top because it's the most current. So if this were, in 2020, it's your most current, certainly put it there. If you've been unemployed for 6 months and now you've just taken an education course through Coursera, you might put that under education and training instead, because I don't want them to think that it is like a 4-year degree type of thing. So in that case, let me just build one real quick here. I'll leave this. I might put education and training. And then underneath that, if I took something really relatable to the needs of this employer, I could say, by the way, it's really cool that that a lot of these courses are actually run by some fairly prestigious institutions. I'm not comfortable putting Duke University by itself, simply because I don't want an employer to say, hey, you're an alumni of Duke University. Well, no, I'm not. I took a course through Duke University through a platform called Coursera. So this could just be one way you could format it, in that it's the most current thing. It's relevant to your job search. And it's the most topical information you currently have. You can also put it under education and training at the bottom of your resume, and that's totally up to you. And you may choose not to list it at all. Maybe it was something you took for it was something you wanted to take personally. If it doesn't relate to your employer or the potential employer, you don't have to put it on there, obviously. We make choices every single day on what we mark. Just because you have it as current doesn't mean you have to list it. Yes, Gloria?
Can you talk a little bit about if someone has gone to college but they did not graduate?
Yeah. So let's say that you went to Duke University. And you went there for 4 years. And it was current. Or say 3 years. That's valuable. That's a life experience. That's something you can market. Say something like, if you are still potentially graduating, if you're still in process, you could say in process towards a accounting degree. If it's not, be realistic about it. If it happened, say 20 years ago, you could say 190 credits towards accounting degree, or something similar. I'm not saying this is the the thing you should put, but you want to somehow say that I wasn't there for a semester. I had significant time there. I had a concentration on a certain type of work. But if you put anything like this, make sure you can prove it. I worked for a company for 7 years, and after 7 years, they had a new process in place, and they said, you have to prove everything on your resume. And I had put something similar. At the time, I had a certain amount of time at a college or university. I had to go to the admissions office. I had to get a transcript, and I had to prove it 7 years after. If I had lied about that, if I had fudged the numbers and said, I was about that, they could have fired me on the spot. So always do your due diligence, get that college transcript, be able to prove anything you say. Gloria, is there another question? You're on mute. You're still on mute. Gloria, can you hear me? You're on mute. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry about that. I was just saying that another way you can put your education if you don't have your degree is just to use the word pursuing. So someone had wrote that they had graduated from Mankato State University, but it is now Minnesota State University, Mankato.
Mhm.
What a person lists.
I am perfectly comfortable saying use the current term. If it is truly a name change, if it is a completely as a takeover and it's a different institution, then you're really, playing with it's not even a gray area. That's being untruthful. If it's like, I'll give you an example. If you graduated from Votech in my area, and you had a degree, that's now Lake Superior College. And it's perfectly fine to put Lake Superior College because it's still the same institution, but you would date yourself immensely by putting the older one. Also, another thing you don't have to do, when you get a degree from the University of Minnesota, it doesn't say UMD or Winona, it says University of Minnesota. Look at your degree. You can put that on there. All right, we got a couple of slides to get through, and then we'll finish with any additional questions we have.
Okay.
Yeah. So second page heading, multiple ways of doing this, but there are reasons to go to a second page. If you have a long career and you've got a lot to say and it's all needed, again, I'd get some feedback from a local career force location, but there are definite reasons to go to a second page in certain circumstances. When you do that, if you're going to print it off, even if you're not going to print it off, you put a second page heading. But if you're going to print it off, do not duplex it, meaning that you don't want to print on both sides. Unless maybe you're going to apply to a very environmentally conscious location, then maybe you think that shows, fit. I'm not sure. But it's the general recommendation not to duplex. You put them on separate pieces of paper. Be aware that, again, on a messy desk, if a piece of paper gets separated from the initial, they're not going to know who that's from. So what you can put is your name, page, and number, and you can put 2 or spell out 2. I've seen it both ways. And then your contact, email and phone. So really what it is a abbreviated header. I've seen people put their full heading in. I tend to not like that because then it looks like that's your whole resume. So it looks like something like this, potentially, and it's left aligned on the top of your page. If you go into continued content, then you would put work history continued as a heading before you go into the next job, or education continued, or trainings continued. There's a lot of different ways to do that. You can look them up online. This little thing here is called a pipe. It's the key right below your backspace on your keyboard. If you hit Shift / you get this pipe, and you see the resumes as a separator between content so that there's clarification. I do use it occasionally. All right. Just an additional thing on non-printing characters. I did throw this slide in simply because it really helps you define what's going on your resume. The reason I threw it in is because there's one I forgot to put in I put this on a slide deck, and that is, go away, these non-printing characters right here, these little squares. So it's an indicated style. So styles are something that you don't necessarily have to put into your resume. They're really good for longer documents, for accessibility options, for table of contents, and all sorts of things. Styles are an awesome tool. I don't use them a lot on resumes simply because they're usually a one-page document. But having said that, Word recognizes something you put in as a style. So your name here is recognized as heading 1. It'll sometimes do some format-wise. It'll carry that forward, and it'll really not allow you to do some things you want to do. So when you see that little square to the left of your paragraph, that means it's a recognized style, and it's going to do certain things with that potentially. No, but I've run into a few situations in which it was not reacting the way I wanted to. And the reason was I was within a recognized style or collection of formats. And that's what was making it work a little differently. And the last thing I'm going to talk about here before we go to a couple of questions, just some additional considerations. Remember that changing your margins means that you have to change the right tab setting. So if I'm here and I've got this right tab setting and I choose to change my margin for whatever reason, now that things are not going to line up on my right margin. Now I'm going to have to go and adjust that right. Not follow margin changes. And by the way, this is way too thin a margin, but for very quick purposes, I wanted to show you that to you. So when you change your margins, and sometimes people do this to go from 1 inch to 0.8 inches to get a resume to 1 page, make sure that you go in and change your right tabs, your right custom tabs. Always check for inconsistency with hyphens. And then last plug I'm going to give, always have someone else look it over. In the Duluth area, that would be Glory, who's with us today. If you're outside the Duluth area, please send it to someone in your area to create that local connection. I'm not going to go through the training resources. It's on the slide deck. If you want to learn more about Word, there's a couple of links I'm going to be sending you. If you want to test yourself on Word, testing resources are North Star Digital Literacy, and you can get a general idea. But I do want to give time just for the last couple of questions. So Gloria, are there anything we need to get to?
Yeah, I'm going to this is a good question. It says, how do you add in retirement factor when you're wanting to go back to work, but you haven't been working for 2+ years?
In that case, you know, it's going to really be a niche job, a job that can accommodate what you want to work. Staffing agencies are a really good place to look at that point. Otherwise, I highly recommend dealing directly with the employer, introduce yourself. You have time of experience to give, but if you truly are looking at this as, you know, I just need to get back and do some stuff. If an employer is going to have a preconceived notion of how long you're going to last in that situation. So if you're applying, make sure you're using a skills-based or functional resume so that you're not showing that, you know, last 2 years being out of the workforce. By the way, this happens every day. There's always people re-entering the workforce. Just use the best marketing that you can. There are jobs out there, I guarantee you, there are hundreds of jobs out there, thousands statewide, that are waiting for people like you. Just make sure that you don't present a potential of no return on investment by training you into that job. I know someone just recently who got a job at a local hardware store for 4 months and was a very valuable employee for that 4 months he was willing to work. And it worked out good for both of them. However, if he had started that conversation saying, yep, you'll have me for 4 months, they would have seen no return on investment and would not have taken a chance on that being a good situation. Okay. Okay, one more question.
All right, we have about half a minute left. How would you deal with the termination?
Okay, on a resume, you don't deal with it. That's nothing you put on a resume. On an application, you put in an involuntary separation. And then I lied. This is the last plug I'm giving for one-on-one assistance. Every situation is different. Your situation is very raw to you right now. Talk one-on-one with a career force representative. Tell the whole story, the emotion and everything, and then figure out a way to take the emotion out of it. Good people are fired every single day. The problem is good people make their case to the potential employer, and that prevents them from getting the job. The key is we don't need to explain why we were right and our former employer was wrong, which is in many cases, that's what happened. It doesn't help you. So you want to say, here's what happened. Here's why it's not a situation going forward. And then you move on. Again, many people get fired during their employment history. It doesn't have as big as impact as people think it does. The reason it has impact is because we let it by overemphasizing it to an employer. But again, I highly recommend you reach out locally. Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate having this time to talk about resumes. You can expect that follow-up information by noon on Monday. I'll make sure I get it all put together, everything I promised you, so you had a good package to help you in your job search. Thank you, Gloria. I appreciate you jumping on as moderator here. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of this beautiful fall day. Have a great day, everybody.